In the end, the choice is yours. Are you going to continue to be a passive observer in your own life, or would you take control and refuse to be told what to notice and what to ignore?
There's going to be a tendency to take yourself to task very harshly, and that can easily be weaponized by people who don't have that proclivity and would like to use it against you.
Whether it's the erosion of free speech or the distortion of scientific fact, there are many things in our world that we're being told not to notice. But by being vigilant and questioning everything, we can avoid falling prey to these tactics.
If you're looking to facilitate people's ability to make positive changes in their own life, there is nothing you can do that's more helpful to that than to make them literate.
Peterson's philosophy is one of personal responsibility and self-reliance. In order to achieve these things, you gotta be willing to see the world as it truly is, rather than through the lenses of others. It's easy to fall into complacency and go along with the status quo, but this is precisely what those who want to control you want. Peterson's message is clear: don't be a pawn to somebody else's game.
I had a rule with my clients because, you might say, well, I've gone halfway down this path and I found out it's wrong. So how do you distinguish that from just giving up? Well, that's a really hard question, right? It's a moral hazard because it's inappropriate to continue in a direction you now realize to be wrong, but it's also inappropriate to give up and use that rationalization as an excuse.
In today's world, the relentless barrage of information is overwhelming, and it's easy to become numb to the things that really matter. However, Jordan Peterson has a warning for those who are too caught up in the chaos to see the truth. As we go about our daily lives, we tend to overlook a lot of things. However, according to Jordan Peterson, there's something more concerning happening.
So one of the principles that I tried to abide by in my therapeutic discussions was you can change course as long as the next thing you do is equally or more difficult. Because that's a check against just giving up. So you want to discipline yourself so you can get yourself organized so that you can go in a particular direction, so that when you find the right direction, you can really go in that direction. Well, get yourself disciplined. Well, why? Well, not so you're a slave, but so that you could be a master. To use a terminology that you're not supposed to use anymore. But, this is in relationship to yourself, not to others. We know that we need to go through a disciplinary process, and we need to subjugate ourselves to a disciplinary process. That's part of the problem with the constant harping about the, oppressive patriarchy. It's like, well, you need a disciplinary process. So, well, that's just oppression and slavery. It's like, no, it's not. No more than a game is. Not a good game. A good game isn't oppression and slavery.
Even when and this has happened to me repeatedly, because I've interviewed a lot of people who've been pilloried and canceled, and when I was ill a while back, and when I sort of reemerged into the podcast sphere after a couple of years, the first person I interviewed was Abigail Schreier, and she'd just written a book called Irreversible Damage about this absolutely god-awful catastrophe on the trans front that physicians and psychologists are collaborating in producing, and much to our shame, let's say. And, Abigail had been pilloried by all the usual suspects and tarred and feathered and with the brush of disgust and contempt. And, even though I've been through this and known many people who've been through it, every time I pick another one of the deplorable people to interview, like you, there's a part of me that goes along with that unthinking mob mentality, such that once the accusation has been made, I'm forced to confront my suspicion that, well, where there's smoke, there must be fire. Well, that's why the presumption of innocence in the legal systems in civilized countries is such a complete bloody miracle, because I also noticed as a clinician, that I was often dealing with people who had been accused in one way or another, often by themselves, of some malfeasance. And I always took the case that my role as a counselor was to begin with the presumption of innocence and to investigate based on that presumption, but also to help my client even in regards to themselves to start with the presumption of innocence. So if someone was feeling very guilty and was depressed, for example, which is that's a situation where the adversary is within and is eating your soul, so to speak, you have to mount a strong defense. And, that means that you should take a very careful look at your weaknesses and your transgressions, but you should do that from the initial presumption of innocence. And that's a hard thing to learn too when you're being prosecuted in the manner that you've been prosecuted, because in order to withstand that without falling prey to the trauma associated with derealization, you have to get your ducks in order so that you can justify to yourself your own claims of innocence. And that means you also have to learn to do that without a kind of careless self-righteousness, and also without that proclivity to move toward more extreme views, which does also lurk as a temptation under such circumstances. The terms misinformation and disinformation are unerring markers that the person who is using them has already become entirely confused about what constitutes the manner in which the world operates. I mean, first of all, who's to say who's wrong about what when the issues are contentious? There's not some board of overseers that has unerring insight into what constitutes the appropriate facts at hand. The world would be a very straightforward place if it was that simple. And I've seen the rise of these terms, misinformation and disinformation, over the last 2 or 3 years, and watched that with dawning horror, because the whole semantic substructure of that classification system is based on the presupposition that the dividing line between fact and fiction, or fact, fiction, and lie, is obvious to anyone with the proper objective stance. And the question is always begged, well, just who is this wizard that can see so clearly through all the murk, especially not post hoc? And as soon as you even allow those terms to exist, misinformation and disinformation, you're already going to find yourself in an extraordinarily dark place. Part of the purpose of a true humanities education is to transmit the difficult to acquire knowledge that actually allows people to become wise enough to forestall that inevitable deterioration towards an idiot and vengeful egalitarianism.
Yes.
Right? It takes a lot of training. Now, you said you had taught ancient languages, for example, to minority students, and people listening might think, well, what the hell good is that? And let me make a case for what good that is very briefly, because it's a case for the humanities, and you can comment on that. Well, first of all, there isn't anything you can do to empower people, which is a word I hate, more effectively than to teach them how to be deeply literate and historically knowledgeable. If you're looking to facilitate people's ability to make positive changes in their own life, there is nothing you can do that's more helpful to that than to make them literate. And if you want to help them understand who they are in the deepest sense, over and above the superficial attractions of tribalism, let's say, you have to educate them deeply in this historical realm that requires the acquisition of explicit knowledge about the central nature of the human being. And that would be the distinguished citizen, let's say, someone capable of upholding the responsibilities of a citizen, and someone worthy of the rights that are part and parcel of that. And without a deep humanities education, all of that disappears, because it has to be transmitted explicitly. And so that was the proper role of the universities for years. That's not optional. That's not optional for human beings. I mean, we are linguistic creatures, and we require an awful lot of cultural programming.
I think we do.
And every culture knows that. And so we're definitely in the situation where if we don't inculcate the wisdom of the past into our young people, then they are forced to regenerate that wisdom through painful and often fatal experience. Those are the options. And to study history and the humanities is to arm yourself against the sea of troubles and to become literate. And that is the core of the universities, and the universities have definitely abandoned that in the favor of this idiot narrative. You know, here's something you might find interesting. So I did a research study with one of my students just before I was basically, kicked out of the university for being persona non gratis. And we investigated two mysteries. The first was there a coherent set of beliefs that you could describe as politically correct? And the way we investigated that was to produce a very large body of political statements, and then to find out the degree to which people agreed with them, and then to analyze them statistically to see if there were patterns of belief. And we found two patterns of belief that were obviously commensurate with the notion of a politically correct set of beliefs. And one of them was like a politically correct liberalism, and the other was politically correct authoritarianism. And there's been quite a bit of research on the psychological front with regards to politically correct authoritarianism in recent years. So first of all, there is such a thing as politically correct beliefs, and there's an authoritarian version. But then you might also ask yourself, what predicts whether or not people will believe these theories? You know what the biggest predictor was? This is so horrible. It was low verbal intelligence. It was a bigger predictor than verbal intelligence is a predictor of grades or socioeconomic outcome. It was 0.45, a correlation whose magnitude you never get in a social science study, a walloping effect. You know, there are stellar opportunities on the educational front at the moment as the responsibility for proper education is abdicated by the universities. There's an economic opportunity and a conceptual opportunity. And, you know, the US is a pretty damn dynamic place on the entrepreneurial front, and it certainly might be the case that new institutions will arise to fill the void that's left by the universities as they collapse. And it might be that places like Hillsdale are on the forefront of that. We'll see how that happens. Well, I think the deck is stacked against everyone to some degree because life is very difficult and we all die. But some people do have it harder than others. And all of us have it very hard at some times in our lives. It's like, well, what's the alternative? You take responsibility for that and try to struggle uphill because the alternative makes everything worse. It's not like it's fair. I know perfectly well that people have brutal lives. I've been a psychotherapist for 20 years. I've seen things you can't imagine. Horror shows that you can't fathom, and people who have been hurt in so many ways, so many dimensions. It's like, bitter? Should they be bitter? Should they be resentful? Should they become violent? These things don't help. They have to struggle uphill despite their excess burden. And it's responsibility, not guilt. You know, it's not necessarily their fault. That's not the point. It's hard to tell. The broader social effect is not going to be good because lots of the things that are happening in the universities that aren't good are already leaking out into the broader social world. Part of what's going to happen is that people are going to stop coming and speaking on campuses. The comedians in the United States, many of them already they won't come and do their shows on campus because everybody's so sensitive to offense. But it also drives political polarization, which isn't a good thing unless you want to drive political polarization. And I think the universities are going to cut the branch off that they sit on.
So you want to commit to something. And then when you commit to something, you require yourself to bring all of your disparate components moving in a single direction, united in a single direction. So it's a unifying act. And then once having been unified, well, then you can bring that unity to bear on a variety of different tasks. But you have to bring it together first. So, and that makes sense developmentally. You see children start out as a disparate bundle of motivations and emotions sort of warring with one another. And then they can integrate that into single games that they can play with themselves. And then they integrate that with games they start to play with other people. And all of that is integration. It's not subjugation, it's not repression. Not if it's a good game, it's integration. You want to get integrated because then you have all the horses that are pulling your chariot pulling in the same direction. And you're much more likely to get to where you want to go then, and also much more likely to specify a good place to go. I mean, even at a scientific level, that's trait conscientiousness, by the way, to be punctual. part of orderliness and dutifulness, industriousness. There's no evidence whatsoever that that varies by ethnicity or race.
Or supremacy.
Yeah, or supremacy. And there is evidence that if you are like that, you are
will
more
become
likely.
supreme.
Well, you are more likely to succeed. It's one. It is the most determining. It's the most potent personality predictor of success in algorithmic domains, managerial and administrative domains. So hard work works. And in fact, the degree to which hard work works is actually the one metric of the health of a society. Like the higher the correlation between conscientiousness and outcome, the healthier the society. Well, obviously. Why? Well, you want the bulk of the credit to go to the people who are the most productive.
Yes.
I mean, not even in some sense because they deserve it, because what does deserve mean exactly? It is because they deserve it, but that's a black box, that word. It's because if you want them to keep making stuff, you have to do that. And you want them to because, well, or what, you don't want food? You don't want shelter? Why would you not reward the people who provide it differentially? It's just your own, even your own narrow self-interest would require that.